So let us start our first panel for today. It's on building and sustaining independent institutions. I will call out our speakers for this session. Please do come up and take your place on the stage. Sir, I have a whole introduction planned for you. I'm sorry. I'll do it fast. Okay. So our first speaker is Jayna Kothari. We request you to please come on stage. Jayna Kothari is a senior advocate and practices in the Supreme Court of India. She's also the co-founder and executive director of the Center of Law and Policy Research. Some of the landmark cases in which she has appeared in include the constitutional challenge in the Supreme Court of India to the right of children to free and compulsory primary education Act of 2009, and the case of National Federation for the Blind versus State of Karnataka. We welcome you, ma'am. Mr. Siddharth Varadarajan, please join us on stage. Siddharth Varadarajan is the founding editor of The Wire. He was earlier the editor of The Hindu and has also taught economics at the New York University and journalism at the University of California, Berkeley, besides working at the Times of India. Welcome. Mr. Shyam Menon. Professor Shyam Menon is a distinguished practitioner of institutional development and renewal at higher education. He was the Vice Chancellor of the Dr. BR Ambedkar University, Delhi, from 2008 to 2018. Under his leadership, AUD has earned distinction for its transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary programs. And finally, Mr. M V Varghese. Welcome, sir. Professor M V Varghese is the former Vice Chancellor of the National University of Educational Planning and Administration, New Delhi. He's also the founding director of the Center for Policy Research in Higher Education. He was at UNESCO IIEP in Paris for more than 2 decades. Welcome, sir. So this session will be convened by our very own Mr. M S Sriram, who is also a board member. Professor Sriram is a faculty member at the IIM Bangalore and is currently working as a chairperson for the Center for Public Policy. In addition to academic and consulting works, he has served at several committees set up by the Government of India, RBI, and Ahmedabad. Welcome. I hand it over to you now, sir.
Distinguished panel members to make an opening remark of about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we can take it forward with questions. I'd sent some indicative questions in advance, basically examining the relationship between independence and source of finance. So if you could talk about that, that would be useful, but there are other things as well. Let's start with Siddharth.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much to the CBPS for inviting me, and congratulations on the milestone that you have accomplished. I'm especially grateful because the subject we're discussing today of creating independent institutions and finding ways to sustain them is one that's especially close to my heart and to the heart of my colleagues at The Wire. As you may know, The Wire is one of the few non-profit, perhaps the only mainstream or the only large non-profit media platform in India today. We are now in our 8th year, and the reason people respect us for the work we do and the reason why we have accomplished what we have is in large measure, I believe, due to the very deliberate choice that we made back in 2015 when it came to structuring The Wire as essentially a non-profit company registered under Section 8 of the Companies Act. And we had before us various options. The conventional option in starting a new media enterprise is, of course, to knock on the doors of institutional investors, or if you lean that way, you could knock on the doors of government and get their support. But for obvious reasons, given the kind of work that we wanted to do, and given the fact that the need of creating the wire itself arose from our understanding by the end of 2014, early 2015, that the media situation in India was getting very, very skewed, and that the room for critical coverage was shrinking. So we said, what India needs is an independent media platform. And you cannot build an independent media platform if you are going to follow the conventional routes of creating a media company. Because, and I know this from my experience, especially at the Times of India, where I worked for 9 years, that journalists may come in all shapes and sizes. Some are willing to compromise, some are not. Many are not. Many editors also would much rather stand their ground in the face of pressure. But the weakest link in the Indian media is the proprietor, the owner, the investor. And they are a weak link because their commitment to freedom of the press is, I would say, purely incidental to their commitment to running a business. To the extent to which speaking about and championing freedom of press related issues helps the business, they would be willing to do that. But when business interests come into conflict with the requirements of media freedom, then they are more often than not willing to buckle. There are some exceptions. I would say the Hindu group, which is a privately owned, it's a family-owned newspaper. But despite the size and the reach of the Hindu, it remains a paper that does not put business interests before editorial. And there are other examples, regional perhaps here and there. But you would be hard-pressed in the world of television to find any example. And I dare say in Hindi media, which is one of the language medias that I follow somewhat, you have Jan Morcha in Faizabad, and you have a few other stalwarts. But in general, the Hindi media also is prone to the same difficulties and the same kind of pressure. So for us, we said we will not create a media platform that's going to have an investor. And if not, then what's the alternative? And so for us, we bet on there being enough interest among the citizenry and reading public of India to want to sustain an independent media platform. It is a truism. Is it a mobile? No, it's not ringing. Okay. It is a truism that if readers want independent media, then they should be willing to pay for it. So for us, the fact that the bulk of Indian media is not paid for directly by the reader or the viewer is an important reason why Indian media is vulnerable to pressure. When the Times of India group, which is the largest newspaper group, earns 95 to 98% of its revenue from advertising, and cover price brings in hardly 2 or 3%. In fact, the economics is so skewed for newspapers that once you reach a certain level of market penetration, as the Times of India has, say, in Delhi or Bombay, the more copies you sell, the more money you lose. Because you're selling the paper for 5 rupees, it costs you 25 rupees to print. And that marginal sale gets you no extra ad revenue, which is the bulk of your revenue. So there comes a point where newspapers actually say, we want to keep circulation down because the more we print, the more we lose. And obviously in such a situation, it's the advertiser who calls the shots, typically private companies, typically government. And then you have businesses, you have media companies that have secondary and tertiary business interests, which often depend on the government for clearances, for licenses. They depend on government goodwill. And most governments, even those who are really quite hostile to the press, even those who are not democratic, I'm talking worldwide, would much prefer to lean on a media organization by targeting the non-media side of their businesses as a means of putting pressure than to actually target a newspaper or a TV channel. Just better optics. So when Dainik Bhaskar came under pressure and annoyed the government for its coverage of the pandemic in Uttar Pradesh, they were the ones who broke the story of by visiting all the Shamshan Ghats along the river and adding up based on the sale of firewood and so on and so forth, and came up with a death toll that was much more than what the UP government was willing to admit. After 2 or 3 months had passed, or maybe 6, 7 months, you had the income tax people and the ED people knocking at the Dainik Bhaskar for economic crimes allegedly committed by other branches of the company. So their power company, their coal mines, etc., etc. And that was an indirect form of putting pressure. So for us, we said the wire will be non-profit. We are not going to have other businesses where we need to depend on the government. And we are confident that the reader will pay. But we were conscious of the fact that to go from zero to a stage where you have enough content and enough of a reputation in the market that readers come to you and readers are willing to pay, you need some kind of a leg up, some kind of financial support for that interim period. And we were very, very fortunate that around the time that me and my colleagues, M.K. Venu and Siddharth Bhatia, were discussing the wire as a non-profit, there was a parallel conversation happening among some high net worth, public-spirited business people, Azim Premji, Rohini Nilekani, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, who for a variety of reasons felt that they needed to put money behind an ecosystem of independent media. They created a foundation called the Independent Public Spirited Media Foundation. And 1 year into our operations, we started in 2015, really on a shoestring budget. Everybody wrote free, nobody took a salary. After a year, we managed to get funding from the IPSMF in Bangalore, and their funding lasted about 3.5, 4 years, and helped us accomplish that critical mass, where by the time they left us in 2020, end of 2019, early 2020, we had more or less become self-sustaining. Today, we are in a situation where we get no large grants. We have an operating budget. We spend around 40 to 45 lakhs a month on everything, salaries, news gathering, rent, and so on. And we raise from readers roughly anywhere from 25 to 30 lakhs a month. And online advertising from Google, so these are automatic ads that Google or YouTube will put, brings us another 8 to 10. And then we scrounge around, knock on people's doors, because we're always short of 2 or 3 lakhs. So we will knock on people's doors closer to the end of the month, and somebody or the other will donate. Lawyer here, professor there, doctor. Some well-intentioned person, and we managed to hoover up, 3 or 4 lakhs from such people, so that we, balance our books, as it were. And we are confident that we can sustain this model indefinitely and even grow it slowly. But the challenge that we face, and that will be the last thing I'll say, and I'm happy to give more details in Q&A, but the challenge that we face, and I was sharing this with some friends over coffee just now, that how do you, it's one thing to, so we are at a steady state of 40, 45 lakhs a month and a certain level of output, which has given us enormous reach. We are one of the more well-recognized media platforms, certainly the more well-respected media platforms in India. There's hardly any town me or my colleagues don't go to where we meet people at railway stations, at airports, who say, look, we read the wire, and you do great work, etc. So we've reached a certain stage of influence. But to go to the next stage requires more output, our video channel, more languages. We have a very successful YouTube channel, more than 4 million subscribers. And we have important, well-known personalities like Arfa Khanum Sherwani or Karan Thapar, who basically, whose faces appear, who are a regular part of our video programming. But how do we take it to the next level? So the challenge that we are now grappling with, in fact, this is a project that me and my colleagues have taken up now, is that can we, because there aren't any big foundations on the horizon. So the scope for philanthropic donations sadly has vanished. IPSMF anyway was putting us on a limited time period, those are their rules. But there are very few large foundations that are, or corporates that are willing to back critical media. And we've come across lots of anecdotal evidence of companies, stories that we've heard of companies who say that, we want to give, but we were told this, et cetera, and so the fact is that, so the challenge for us is how do we create a corpus of 2 to 3 crore that will allow us to engage in some expansion, fully confident that that expanded level of output in 3 years' time would pay for itself. But how do I bridge that 2 to 3 year period? In other words, in a situation where Indian corporates don't want to give or are too scared to give, and FCRA does not allow us to get funding from abroad. This is a challenge that we are grappling with, and I'll be very happy to hear any ideas or suggestions. As a non-profit with tax exemption, there is also a constraint on the amount of commercial income we can earn. Otherwise, we could come up with various things to organize events, commercial events, but to maintain your income tax exemption status, commercial earnings cannot be more than 20% of your total revenue. So this is an additional constraint, so engaging in commercial activities to raise some money is not an option for us, because then that would put us in violation of the 80-20 rule. So these are some of the challenges, but I would say, based on where we are today, I would highly recommend to other media platforms to look at not necessarily being non-profit, but the Indian reader's capacity to pay and the willingness to pay should not be underestimated. And I would say that if you look at small other digital platforms, News Laundry or the News Minute, which is Bangalore-based, or Scroll, all of them have, are generating significant amount of revenue in the form of subscriptions and contributions from readers. And so I think that something that the big newspapers shied away, like when I was at the Hindu, for example, the management was petrified of raising the cover price. That if we make it from 3 rupees to 4 rupees, then we will lose readership, etc. And they were unwilling to bet on the readers' willingness to pay. But I think we've shown in digital media that if you give good content that you can't get anywhere else, then readers are willing to pay. Perhaps not to the same level and with the same ease and as readers in the West, who are much more used to having a paywall. But certainly, if you give content and make it clear to readers that if you don't pay for it, this stuff can't survive, then I think it is possible for us to reach some level of sustainability in that manner. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Siddharth. Shyam, you've been in the academic world, so there is much more of state control when you're in the state university. How did you build AUD in spite of the state, or despite the state?
Well, and thank you, Sriram. AUD was, of course, was born in a very fortuitous kind of circumstances when in Delhi, the Lieutenant Governor and the Chief Minister used to talk to each other. And those days are gone. So we were lucky when both of them in unison asked me to set it up. So that there was, in that sense, a guarantee of cooperation between the the union government and the state government. Because we had to depend on both. Land, for instance, there's the union government which had to. So Jaypal Reddy was equally, supportive of us as Mrs. Dikshit was, and so on. So anyway, let me begin at the beginning. When I was asked to set it up, I knew that it is not something which I can do myself. So we gathered together a team of people who have worked together in Delhi University, Indira Gandhi National Open University, and Baroda University, and a few others. And most of us have been, how do you put it, deeply dissatisfied with the way higher education has been going. Particularly those of us in Delhi University who were part of the administration, and we knew exactly the problems there have been. So we decided that there's an opportunity which doesn't come to many people to set up a new university. So we took it very seriously. And all that we ensured that in this team there were people with authentic experience and confident enough to experiment and make mistakes and make mid-course corrections, and also the readiness to say no, readiness to dissent, because if the team did not have people who could say no, then I think it's very scary for a person who is leading the team. We had actually been quite bogged down by the inertia and smugness in so-called better universities like Delhi University or even JNU for that matter. There is a certain smugness which actually makes universities incapable of moving further. The Act and the statutes have already been created while I was asked. I was given this Act and statutes by the Lieutenant Governor. That was unfortunate in the sense these were actually based on templates which we had actually inherited from the colonial times. So those are very, very inhibitive, and those have to be imaginatively reframed, but that couldn't be done because these are all essentially, done by cutting and pasting from other existing acts and statutes. So what we had to do was actually to find elbow spaces even of working within these. And we knew that I was not G. Parthsarthi or, people like that. And so we were quite aware of our own ordinariness. But together we thought that, even a few ordinary people can also do extraordinary stuff if we are quite determined to do that. That's what we did, tried to do. And the first 5 years was smooth. The next 2-3 years were also smooth. And yeah. But anyway, the starting principle was that the university essentially is a community, self-governing community of scholars. That the assumption we took up and then we pursued because nothing else could have been. And if that's the case, the priority was on attracting faculty. So if you do a time on task analysis of what I did for 10 years, I would say that the bulk of the time was actually in searching for, selecting and retaining good faculty. I must have conducted something like 2,500 interviews to select 250 faculty members. And all of them were actually 40 minutes, 50 minutes, 1 hour, 1.5 hours interviews. So these were the serious stuff. So people were thankful also. People used to, even those of them who did not get selected also used to write back and say that how they felt good having attended these interviews. So faculty selection was, of course, the major thing. And to identify the first 25 faculty was the most difficult. To identify and select the first. So what I used to do is actually is go to JNU library, Teenmurti and many other libraries and look at journals. These are areas which I have no training in. I'm basically a pedagogue. I work in education faculty. So I can't even say that I'm a full-fledged social scientist. So we used to read international journals and browse through international journals, the cover pages particularly, and find out the coordinates of Indian-sounding names and write to them. saying that, do you have students, or PhD scholars available who are ready to come back, etc., etc. So 2008 was a good time to do that because the meltdown and the recession was happening in the West, and many social scientists were not getting any job. They were all coming back. So we really took the maximum advantage. Got the first 25, 30 people when we appointed. They attracted the rest. So my job was made much easier subsequently. Then one of the things which we learned quite early in life is this public policy, public administration principle that the sponsoring organization expects the sponsored organizations to gradually become isomorphous to their own culture. So in the, Azim Premji University would look like an NGO, and Munjal University will look like a corporate house, and most of the government universities would look like government. So the financial code and the way they conduct, the suspicion, mistrust, the whole thing, the whole culture of mistrust on which the entire thing edifice is created. So that is something which we needed to really work against. And we also realized early in life that, in our life, that the government expected us to behave like a government department. And the Act and the statutes actually guarantee a lot of autonomy, but what really matters is actually the conditionalities, the 3-page conditionalities which come along with every tranche of grant in aid that the government releases to the university. That comes with 3 or 4 pages of a list of conditionalities. So eventually that is what really matters, no matter what autonomy is mentioned in the Act and the statutes. And another thing which we realized, that it's not enough to be pally with Mrs. Dikshit and Mr. Khanna. It was also necessary to have a relationship with everybody right till the lower division clerk in the Delhi government. Because everybody can have they have the power of stopping, writing a note which nobody will be able to then write anything against. Those of you who have been in bureaucracy knows this very well. I don't have to tell you. What we tried to create was actually a collegiality. So there was, one realized that, before that I must also say one thing. One thing we realized also with dealing with the state is that there's a difference between bureaucratic state and political state. And the political state and the higher bureaucratic state, particularly this all India civil service people, would behave in a certain manner, and they are birds of passage. They would move from Delhi to Andaman Nicobar to Goa and various other places. Whereas the real staff whom we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis is the departmental staff in the Directorate of Higher Education. And that's the toughest part. So, I don't think we learned, we were very successful in dealing with that. We tried to make the maximum of the statutory bodies that were available, the Board of Studies and Academic Council. In fact, people used to be wary of it. But Academic Council meetings used to be like morning till evening. It was mostly reflective. The actual Academic Council decisions were only very little. The statutes, the statutory resolutions which they have to make at the end of the day is only very few. But the deliberations were, and we were fortunate to get very good people to be on our boards. We had Shyam Menon, the National Law School founder. We had Parashraman later from Tata Institute. We had Armeti Desai, who was also in the Tata Institute of Social Science later, UGC chairperson. All these people on our board, and that really elevated, the way the discourses within the body. So people also started taking ourselves more seriously. People who came from other universities, they would see, no matter, although it's a new university, people come with their own baggage. And it's mostly conditioned thereby by what is happening in other places. But the financial, the autonomy is what autonomy does, that we realized. And then, there's no point in just having paper autonomy. So, and we also realized that the more we depend on the government funding, the less autonomous we are, in effect. In Delhi University, for instance, 80 to 90% of its OPEX, operational expenditure, are on salary and pension. And very little is there available then to deploy for quality and other kinds of stuff. So what we arrived at, and this for which we had actually help from people like Pankaj Chandra, who was helping us. He was also on our board. We arrived at a formula of 50%, not more than 50% dependence on grant in aid from the government, and 20% maximum ceiling from student fees, and 30% from other sources. The 20% student, it may appear to be low, but in comparison to JNU, which is only 0.59% contribution by student fees into the operational expenditure, or Delhi University, which was around 10% because of its size, we were attempting to do 20%, which made the fee structure slightly higher, in fact, much higher. So we had to create a differential fee structure. So differentiate between those who can afford to pay and those who can't. So, and also the fees became calibrated on the base of the number of credits. So the credit-wise units were there, undergraduate and postgraduate and professional. Credit-wise we defined. And undergraduate credit will be 1,300 rupees per credit, which is itself very high. And in MBA, on the other end, will be about 3,000 rupees per credit, which is very high. So in the public system. But everybody less than 600,000 rupees family income got fee waivers. So many of them full fee waivers, some of them partial fee waivers. And so there is a kind of a, cross subsidy which was happening. Plus we also created programs with specific sponsorship, like Tata, Ford. We created an MPhil program in development practice, which is in collaboration with Pradhan, which is, and we had this field immersion in places like Chhattisgarh, and it's a very, very intense, capital intense, very operational expenditure intense kind of a program, which we couldn't have done without the help of Tatas. Then we created a body called the FAUD, the Friends of Ambedkar University, Delhi, in the United States, under the US Act. And the Sarah Miller McCune, the publisher, co-founder of Sage, she donated the first $650,000 for that. And Veena Das was made the chair of the board of the, and a few other American citizens. And we had nothing to do with it. It's only, our name was there in their society, but we had no control over them. But the idea was to keep a corpus of money and its proceeds available in US dollars back in the United States, so that our students can actually make use of it when they apply. So like applying for a bursary, they would apply to FAUD, and they would be awarded a bursary for travel and for some kind of conference attending and so on and so forth. And then another thing which we were attempting before, when I was leaving, was the AUD press. We wanted to start a university press, and the first would have been the volume in which your article is there, Anuradji, on Ambedkar's, the 10 Ambedkar Memorial lectures we put into one volume. We have done it. That was the first publication of the AUD press, but unfortunately it didn't survive. Then we wanted to start a consultancy company under Section 8, by the way, on social science research. So we thought that we had a pool of people basically available for, for extending their services, their expertise in social science research. So BATAS will make you, we were the largest social science community, even larger than the School of Social Science in JNU. The entire university was a social science community. For that, I think that was our strength. So these were the kinds of things in which we tried to ensure that we could reach the target of not more than 50% of the operational expenditure being dependent on the government grants. By the way, all these were done, particularly I must also talk about the SMT. We created an informal, internal governance board, internal management board, governance board, called the Senior Management Team, which was not chaired by the Vice Chancellor. It was chaired by Chandan. As a senior most faculty, Chandan Mukherjee used to chair it. And they meet every 15 days and do the internal administrative coordination work, and also a lot of suggestions for future planning and so on and so forth used to come from there. All this was done essentially with the assumption that no matter who is at the helm, I think things should go on. Did it happen? No, it did not happen. What might be the reason? One has to understand. So one probably need to understand why a place like JNU is able to sort of hold back and push back a little bit. Is it that 50 years that they have more than Ambedkar? Or is it that something else? Is it the critical mass of people who are thinking in a certain direction? Or is it a institutional memory, which actually a shared institutional memory which should keep inspiring people? These are difficult times, and I think all of us feel despondent. So, but I would tend to think that institutions, have their ups and downs. But as the memory of having transited through a very exciting period would actually continue to inspire people in the institution. I met a graduate from Ambedkar University, Delhi, right here. He's doing his PhD in IAS. So he was telling me how nice his undergraduate days in Ambedkar was, and how it is still continuing to inspire some of the teachers he remembered, and so on. So I tend to think, I'm not romanticizing, I'm only tending to think that as Arunaji said, the utopia is in the horizon, but we must continue to walk. If we all become very despondent, then I think there's no question of building any institution. So even if it is for finite periods of time, after all, in this 10 years, Ambedkar must have produced something like 3,000, 4,000 graduates, and they must have gone out with various places, and they must be making some kind of a trickle effect into what really made those heady days of Ambedkar University, Delhi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank the Center for Budgets and Policy Studies for inviting me and organizing this meeting, especially Dr. Jyotsna. Thank you very much. And I feel very comfortable after listening to Arunaji, because we feel that I am at the right place. Because when we go to many meetings and inaugural addresses nowadays, especially in Delhi and many other states, we feel that we are at the wrong place and the participants are at the right place. I feel although the heart is to the left, the heart is to the right place in this audience and organization. So I am very happy about it. Friends, one thing that worries me after getting this letter from Dr. Jyotsna was that, how do we look at the public institutions and private institutions that have come up in the last 60 years in India? And how did they support and help policy-making process, or did not support policy-making processes? I tried to make an analysis and try to divide the different stages of development of the institutional support for policy-making in India. The first is the setting up of the institutions in the 1950s. I'll come to a little bit of details given the 10 minutes time. And the second one is that using of the material that is produced, research that is carried out by these institutions for policy making, that is between around 65 to 75 or 80. And then you find that a commercialization or marketization of the knowledge production that has taken place, and the growth of NGOs and how they have distorted the ongoing social streams of knowledge development. Then lastly, how these institutions survive in the post-truth era. I think if we are in the post-truth era, and what research will do, what research can do, and what research cannot do. I think these are the 4 phases in which I try to see this. Then I will also add, since I come from a policy institute, I was in a policy institute, I will also add what NIPA did in terms of policy support as a footnote to some of the things that I am referring to. What you find is that India has the largest number of research institutions in any developing country. And if you see that 80% of the research institutions in South Asia is located in India. And what is also important to note is the fact that these research institutions are not always funded by the external agencies. These were many of them public institutions created by the public body in India. And I was wondering why such a change has happened. I could identify 3 or 4 factors which are important for the establishment of large number of institutions in India. First one was that we adopted a democracy as our reigning principle for going ahead with that. If you look at the post-liberation history of many of the developing countries, you do not find that a democratic framework was accepted. At that point of time, 1950s, and even today it is true that India is having the lowest per capita income having a democratic society. So this is a very important, even at a very lower levels of poverty, we adopted a democratic framework. The second one was that we also adopted a public sector dominated framework. The third one is that we created what is called as a planning commission, which is very important for decision-making processes and the support that is extended by the public institutions. But not only public, institutions in general, at that point of time. The fourth is very important point is that the political process was ready to accept the intellectual traditions and contributions made by the intellectuals of that time. I can name 10 people or 15 people who shaped the decision-making process and policy-making process in different aspects in India. But I don't, time does not permit, so I'm not getting into that. So let me say that in the 1950s, it was not only we created the largest number of bridges and dams for a different purpose, but also largest number of institutions were set up. I think among the institutions too, I feel, which played a very dominant and a contributory role is one is the National Council of Applied Economic Research. Such a institute did not exist in many places. And we created that, and that was established in 1956. And I think many of the leaders at that point of time played an important role. Why it is important is that it is coming out of, normally institutions were established because of supply-driven factors. But in India, institutions were established because of a demand-driven factor. Because of there is a planned development that is taking place. And the second institution is CSO, Central Statistical Organization. And these two institutions have really changed the way decision-making process takes place. Since the politicians of at that time were ready to listen to the intellectual traditions and the analysis that are made by, empirical analysis that are made by these institutions, many of the decisions were empirical based and evidence-based decision-making was taking place because of this, that is my first contention. The second period where we find is that in the late 60s and early 70s onwards, many of these institutions which were established became very vibrant, very dynamic, very active in producing research evidences much more than what they could do in the 1960s. What is important is that in 1953, the Planning Commission created a committee called Research Program Committee, 1953. And I think this committee over a period of time, and the committee at that point of time was functioning based on the professors in the different universities. And it is this committee which later, in a sense, I may be overstepping my position if I say that, the ICSSR, which came into existence in 1969, which established 27 research institutions in the country, they came out of this 1953 small cell that was created in the Planning Commission. Or in other words, what I am trying to say is that since we adopted a plan to development, there was a demand that was created. And it will not be out of place to say that some of the people like either with Ken Raj or with Mahalanobis and many others who are responsible for creating the demand for data, especially the second 5-year plan in 1956. The first plan was not based on that much database, although K. Raj was responsible for drafting chapters of it. It was not based on the data because data were not available. So we created, so the demand came for that, In the 70s and 80s, what we find is that we had a different type of arrangement whereby these institutions produced a large amount of empirical analysis and data. And what is important to notice is that the research shifted from the universities to the research institutions. It's very important to see that. Universities try to rely mostly on secondary sources of data and NSS sources of data and census data. And this has become too much nowadays as a result of the decline in the public funding for universities. And the research institutions, they try to create data through the empirical analysis, etc. So there is a shift in the decision making, and the earlier tradition of what 1948 Higher Education Commission mentioned about linking
research and teaching could not take place because the research that was carried out was firstly not in the universities. Secondly, it was not related to the teaching that was taking place. The teaching and the curriculum remained more fossilized, whereas the research was more empirical based and more day-to-day based, So there was a diversion that was taking place. So for example, if you take the first education policy in India, that was based on Kothari Commission report, which was specifically created to analyze the educational situation in India. If you take 1986 policy, it was not based on any commission report or such a detailed study. It was based on the challenges document which NEPA produced at that point of time. And that is one of the most widely discussed one. So the nature changed over a period of time. The locus of decision making and creating empirical evidence or evidence-based decision making substantially changed over a period of time. Then comes the stage of in the external agencies coming, funding started, liberalization policy started, and two things that happened is that NGO sector, many NGOs, there was a multiplication of NGOs that were created in India, and many of them claimed to be the strong researchers, although they did not have a research base. And what was the advantage? In many time, international agencies and funding agencies relied on them. And that was the first stage where the data produced by and the information provided by, the analysis created by and the publications made by the public institutions started declining. And what is required is this, what is to be produced by the NGOs. I'm not against the NGOs, that is not the point. I'm talking about a trend that is a dominant trend. So that was the way in which it is happening. And for the NGOs who are totally dependent on funding, and many a time it is not the national funding. When the total literacy campaigns were there, quite a possibility, there was a lot of possibilities of getting funding from the government. Otherwise, it's also dependent upon that, This is another stage where I feel that market intervened, conclusions were given first, data was collected later, and report was written at the end. So, but the conclusions were given first. So that is a change in the total research dynamics that is taking place. The third stage, or the fourth stage, I will not have much time. The fourth stage I am talking about is the post-truth era. I think we should be very careful that we are all living in the post-truth era, but I don't want to take many examples from India. So let me say that the biggest war and highest amount of money was spent on Iraq war. What was the basis of Iraq war? Weapons of mass destruction were created by Saddam Hussein. And 23 years have passed after that war. Nobody could find weapons of mass destruction. And nobody could be held responsible for killing hundreds of American soldiers and thousands of Iraqis, not soldiers, thousands of Iraqis, So that was a very clear-cut case where you find, and many people in the United States even today believe that the election was stolen by Biden. It is not only in 2020 when the elections took place, even today, a good, I will not say majority, a good share of people still believe that. So we are living in a post-truth era. So for example, if I say that unemployment is very high, inflation is very high, agriculture distress is very high, I don't know whether I am nationalist or an anti-nationalist. I do not know whether I am telling the truth or research. So if I want to get money, what should I say? There is a change that has taken place. Previously, what funding agencies were trying to do is also trying to see that. So the public institutions are withdrawing from their initial tradition of providing reliable data-based analysis for decision making. I think that is the danger that is taking place. That is the danger that you find as a major problem for institutional independence. I will not use the word independence. I will use the word autonomy. Because, the question is that how you can assert autonomy in this context is the biggest challenge, without compromising on the financing. Because many institutions still rely heavily on financing from the government. So you cannot displease the government beyond a point, but at the same time, you cannot compromise on the conclusions that you are drawing. So that is the problem that we find. So today, if you are not producing evidences which are supportive of the policies that are made, it is not the other way around. Previously, we used to give the evidences to produce policies. But today what we are saying is that we make the policies and we have to create supporting evidences to that. That is the dramatic change that is taking place. That is the place where independence or autonomy of the institutions are challenged today. And I think I end by saying that I was the Vice Chancellor and I was the founding director of a center. I don't believe in the question of this autonomy being manipulated by the government beyond a point. Autonomy, my understanding as the head of the institution, as the Vice Chancellor, is that, and you know, my institution is working closely with the government in all policy matters, and almost every day I had to attend meetings in the ministry, more perhaps spending more time in the ministry and policy making. But I will say that autonomy is something not to be demanded, not to be granted. It is something that is to be asserted. It is the question of the leader's capacity to negotiate with the government for funding and assert autonomy. I think today the major challenge is this leadership is in question. That is because the way the leadership is selected is also a question. I was also a Vice Chancellor, so I also belong to that category. But I say that, so that is the place where when you talk about autonomy, when you talk about independence of institution, when we talk about how institutions play an important role in facilitating policy making, which is made more evidence-based. You know. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm the last speaker on a fabulous panel. Thank you, first of all, Dr. Jyotsna and others at CBPS for inviting me, and congratulations to CBPS on reaching this amazing milestone. When we're talking of sustaining independent institutions, and you know, we've had a wide range of different institutions, universities, media houses. At the Center for Law and Policy Research, we've had a different path, and I'd like to kind of just kind of give you all a brief outline of how we went about and what are some of the challenges facing us now. So the Center for Law and Policy Research is an NGO, and this we set it up about 14, 15 years ago. We're going to complete 15 years. We set it up because we felt at that time, in late 2009, that we felt that there was a dearth of, there was a lack of research work done in the law, using the law, because we came from a law background, the founders. We said research in law universities was not being done, like you mentioned, on core issues that were of importance in the area of social justice. Secondly, such research was not feeding policy initiatives. And thirdly, the litigation, you know, strategic litigation was being done, didn't have a research base. And so we felt that we wanted to set up an institution that would marry these three arms together, litigation, research, and policy work. And it was with that aim that the Center for Law and Policy Research was set up to do cutting-edge legal research, to give this research input for policy development, and to do strategic litigation and public interest lawyering, which is not just public interest litigation, but really lawyering for the marginalized, which is based on our research and policy work. And it was with that initiative that we set it up. Now, when we set this up, initially our model was not to take funding, because you know, the same, we had those initial debates at that time was, you know, would foreign funding, of course, we didn't even apply for FCRA and all of that, but we said, would funding or foreign funding control our independence or autonomy? Would it, you know, come in the way of us taking up issues and working on issues that we wanted to? And also there was no such ready funding available as well. So for a long time, initially, I think for the first several years, we continued completely without funding, trying to offset our practice. Some of us who started off, the initial founders, were practicing lawyers and academics. So we offset our practice in the traditional way that a lot of initial human rights lawyers had done, to offset their commercial practice and to support pro bono work. So we initially did that by using our practice-related income to support a couple of researchers and support a couple of staff whom we could hire and to be part of the center. And it was only much later that we started applying for funding, both domestic and foreign funding. We managed to get FCRA and then started larger projects, both on research and policy and litigation. And so, while that went on, I think some of the challenges midway through, and I think now, post-COVID, our themes had always been our core theme of our organization was to make the Constitution work for everyone. And how do you make the Constitution work for everyone? Our focus areas were really looking at most vulnerable groups, Dalit Adivasi persons with disabilities, women and girls, transgender and intersex persons. These were largely our focus areas. And we did manage to get support and foreign funding for that. But then, when even pre-COVID and during COVID, you realize that the kind of issues that come up just expand and expand and expand, right? And how does an organization dealing with constitutional rights issues with limited capacity, how does it, should we respond to some issues, emerging issues, or should we not respond? And so those definitely were challenges plaguing us. But yes, we took up a lot more, with COVID, we expanded our reach on the area of, issues we took up. And this is amidst not just COVID, which kind of expanded the recognition of inequalities that we're seeing in our country, but also the simultaneous kind of clamp down that human rights activists, human rights lawyers, human rights defenders started facing. And that also made us think, we had, for the first 7-8 years, we had never thought of, like a thought never crossed our mind as to what issues we would take up to litigate or to take up to write about and work on. And with several human rights defenders and lawyers being arrested, being charged under serious charges, I think a lot of legal groups had to, of course the thought does cross your mind, can we take up this work? What, will we be able to stay afloat? Will we, will we be arrested? I mean, that is really the thought that crossed all our minds. And so now when we kind of look at some of our challenges now, it's twofold. One is funding. How do we go forward with funding? We're seeing that for a lot of NGOs, there's a real issue of if they're dependent on foreign funding, whether our FCRA license will be renewed. Many of them have lost their FCRAs and are unable to get foreign funding. And so that is a question that looms over our heads, over our institution when our FCRA is due for renewal in a couple of years. And so are we going to be able to be dependent on that? We've started expanding our funding support to get domestic funds and domestic grants because we don't want to be dependent on foreign funds. But sources of domestic grants is limited. I think Siddharth Varadarajan spoke about, initiatives like getting the independent public-spirited media, like a fund organized, and we don't have that for rights-based work. We do have a few philanthropic grant-making organizations, but I think we have to broaden that scope. How do we we don't get corporate funding for rights-based work, for legal work, and so can, we think of initiating certain seed organizations like the media, like it's done in the media space, to support human rights work, rights-related work. I think that is something definitely we need to think about. And secondly, while on the one hand we're thinking of ways to support funding so that we're able to sustain our team and our work, the second challenge is how do we really stay independent or autonomous, the way you spoke about, in our work. so that we are, we are fearless in taking up the work that we want to take up. And in the last recent times, we've worked on really important issues. We've drafted an equality law, an equality bill, which seeks to ensure non-discrimination for a wide range of prohibited groups based on, whether it's based on faith, food, gender identity, sexual orientation, caste, political belief, etc. Of course, the law is just a bill, and there's no real scope of it being passed at any time soon, but really to initiate conversations on an equality law. We've worked with other groups to draft an honor crimes prohibition law bill, which we hope will be introduced at least by in Parliament in the coming session. And we've seen how caste-related violence, interfaith marriage-related violence has escalated over the last 3-4 years. So we've continued to work on many of these areas, knowing fully well that work, especially rights-based work on these areas, is going to be contentious, is going to attract negative attention, but this is the work that we feel we have to do, and so the challenge also is to continue being able to do that work. And I think despite these challenges, while we figure out how we're able to sustain or get funding, I think the silver lining is that we've been able to continue doing this work. Some of our work around intersectionality, around issues of gender identity and caste, we've managed to, with our litigation and research support in Karnataka, Karnataka government has introduced an amendment providing 1% reservation for transgender persons in government employment, which has never been done in the country at any other place. So we're working really with multiply discriminated groups and activists to really ensure that their demands and voices are framed within the law, and we have research support to push for such changes. And I think our way forward is that we want to be able to continue doing this work. We need funding to be able to do that, and we just have to find a way out. Thank you.
Okay. As the mic comes, let me try and use my decibel levels. Thanks a lot for these very interesting observations, which followed very nice but not a very optimistic talk by Aruna Roy. In one of the Kannada writers, there was a joke that was doing around that, oh, this guy, he has a very bright future behind him. When he started off, he looked very promising, but didn't live up to this thing. So I think we are living in not only a post-truth world, but a past glory world. So from the 4 presentations that I found, I was trying to look at if there is a sort of overarching theme on the relationship between funding and independence or autonomy. So from Siddharth, one would surmise that the form of organization is important, that if you are a not-for-profit, that in itself insulates you from a whole lot of pressures that would challenge your independence. I mean, that's the sort of theme that I got. From Shyam, it was much more about building a culture of autonomy. Doesn't matter where the funding comes from. Even if you hobnob with the government, that's fine, but you need to build a culture of autonomy, and you should this thing. So it is a little bit of personalities, it's a little bit of team that you build, and it's a little bit of thought process that you build on how you look at autonomy. And Professor Varghese said autonomy is there for you to take. It is not given, it is not sought. You just need to assert your autonomy, and does not matter what the context is. With Jayna, she said, broadly, if you chase the cause, the money possibly will follow. And cause is what is important. So looks like there are 4 broad approaches that each one of them have taken. But all these have been working in a certain context, and that is the past that we are talking about. That context is that there is a context of certain reasonableness and assurance that this is what the ecosystem is all about. You know, obviously the ecosystem has never worked ideally, but you would say that, okay, if you are a good organization, it's likely that your FCRA will be granted. If you're maintaining your accounts well and you're doing, you know, decent work and so on. Similarly, I'm not sure if Siddharth were to start all over again with the independent spirited media foundation still support you. If you started today and next year would they put in money is a question that we need to ask. Is that context still around? I guess that is something that is fundamentally changing and making us despondent, that whatever were the reasonable assumptions that we had about the context is possibly not there. So I'll stop here. I have questions, but I will not ask them because it's better that the audience gets to ask the questions. I will do a one-on-one with each of them over lunch. So any questions from the audience, I'm happy to. We have another 15 minutes to go. Would that be a reasonable time? Yeah. Ramesh has the mic and he'll, anybody who put your hand up, yeah. Can you identify yourself, please?
My name is Raghavendra Prasad. I'm an independent investigative journalist. My question is to Siddharth. So since I'm in the same lines, Siddharth, like you just highlighted one challenge, lack of public support while you started way back. Independent institutions rely on public support to maintain their legitimacy and influence is what you mentioned. And however, in some cases, the public may not understand the importance of these institutions or may not trust them due to lack of transparency or accountability, especially in an independent media organization like this. Can you help us understand how did WIRE tackle this? And you also pointed out that WIRE did not follow the conventional rules of forming an independent media organizations. So what are the top 3 non-conventional process ideas which WIRE follow and how it was successful?
Should I answer that?
Yeah, please go.
Yeah, look, I mean, the starting point was to be a non-profit, right? And even within that, we chose a slightly more difficult path. In many states, it's far more easy to register yourself as a trust. And there's, in fact, the governance requirements are much less for trusts. And hence, they're also much more prone to abuse and more vulnerable to suspicion. And so we said, no, we're going to be non-profit. We're going to be Section 8 company and go through all the disclosure requirements that are required. Then we are another unconventional method we follow is that we are very transparent with our finances. You will never find any other media person disclosing how much they spend and earn and what the sources of revenue are in any given month. The way I've unfolded before you, and we even have, we put out on tweets a summary of, because when our enemies began to spread rumors that, oh, there's money coming from here and there and all kind of nonsense. So we put up a very simple pie chart with the full breakdown of the first 6 years of funding, which, what were the sources of revenue. So I think that kind of transparency, and then, it goes a long way in building public trust and public support. We are one of the few organizations to have a public editor or a reader's editor. In other words, an ombudsperson who is meant to be a conveyor belt for reader concerns, grievances, complaints, and also to go into them and adjudicate on them. And our committee, so our ombudsperson is Pamela Philippos, who's a very senior journalist. And she's not a staff member of the WIRE, so she's not, we have no control over her. and we are obliged to publish what she sends us. This is our commitment to the readers. And today in the Indian media, I think Scroll and The Hindu and us, there's just 3 of us have this. And we've encouraged other media organizations to do that as an added measure of transparency, but there's a great deal of hesitation. So I think the more transparent you are in your dealings with readers, I think the greater the likelihood that you will secure their trust, and they will also then recognize the value of what you're doing and then come forward and support you.
Thank you. Maybe I'll direct my question to you and then you can decide where. It seems to me that independence is crucial. It's extremely important. But perhaps this is not enough. We have to ask independence of what? It seems that we have been talking mostly about the independence from or independence of the government or maybe the market. But also independence could be thought a little deeper than that. Do an organization needs independence from its own capriciousness and the ideological leanings? Do we need some positive anchor together with the independence, which may be either reason or truth, or say constitutional principles or something? So it seems to me that when we are talking of independence alone, and that the question hangs on independence from what, we also need something positive to anchor on, to safeguard that. And I do believe that defining that positive first seems to be much more important. Partly comment, partly asking your opinion on this different way of looking. Actually, I am drawing from the definition of rational autonomy, where external pressures should be warded off, but at the same time, my own desires and capriciousness, etc., also I should have self-control in interest of truth and reason. Then only I could be called rationally autonomous. Actually, I am drawing on that concept. Thank you.
Ideally, I would have given this question to Siddharth because that seems to be ideal for Siddharth, but I'd request Shyam to address it.
No, I think constitution is the framework. As Aruna said this morning, that I think when we were students, we thought that it's very retrogressive, but now we realize that that's the last straw that we have to clutch onto. So that would be the guiding principle. I have no doubt about that in my mind. But so far as education is concerned, I mean higher education is concerned, I have one concern. The way we are going, it's all the way we are going. It appears that I think we are getting into a period of what could be, similar to the Cultural Revolution of China in the 1960s. And it's quite possible that I'm seriously apprehensive that there will be a kind of a hiatus and a discontinuity in the tradition of scholarship. And more important, I think there will be a discontinuity in the assembly line of scholars in this country. See, on the one hand, I think universities would no longer be the places where knowledge primarily gets generated, particularly those knowledge which is critical and critically engaging with contemporary society. So that's quite likely that that tradition of scholarship would move out of the university to somewhere else. So we already see, I see people like Ramchandra Guha or Madhavan Palat, or all these people are working from outside the university, but then they are also engaged in scholarship of some kind, and that this particular thing can be a trend, because you can't stop creativity of this kind just by shutting up the university. But what is really, really problematic is, I think, the assembly line. See, India has had an excellent generation of economists at some point because there was presidency college. I mean, most of the leading economists of that time were all Tapas Majumdar's students when they were back in presidency college. And similarly, the best undergraduate education in this country has created a whole assembly line of scholars. And that is getting affected by essentially because of one thing, this vertical line of control and regulation. This whole architecture of regulatory architecture that is being put in place at the moment, that even it sort of dismantles even federalism, and to the extent that every bit of it is to be accounted for. For instance, the state of Haryana has issued to all its universities that there should be one single timetable for all universities in Haryana. Can you imagine? So everything has to be known, to be declared, and it has to go on as though we are on a march together. So this centralized architecture of control and regulation is going to kill particularly undergraduation and liberal undergraduation. And I do think, and I remember in the 80s in Palestine, at that time the Palestinian liberation, the state had not been established, this liberation struggle was going on. They started a university called Al-Quds Open University. This was the university of the trenches. They were basically meant for young kids, particularly boys, who never had a chance to go to college because they were involved in day-to-day, their struggle. So Al-Quds Open University had scholars participating from all over the world. And those days, just cyclostyling this material and making it available to them. And later they can write an exam, and some of the leading universities in Europe and others were ready to certify for their performance. I would tend to think that an informal way in which to ensure that there is a tradition of creating young scholars for critical thinking, critical engagement with society and knowledge pertaining to society is absolutely necessary. And that's something which now will slip out of established university system gradually, if the trend is what we see at the moment. So that's what I would say. Long answer to a short. Thank you.
My name is Arun. I am a public finance researcher with Civic Data Lab. My question is, how important is heterogeneity of people who are part of the organizations in terms of maintaining independence? Heterogeneity of identity, gender, class, caste, as well as ideology, economic, social and political ideology. How much of that is important in ensuring that an institution stays independent over a period of time? And secondly, can independent institutions escape the vicious cycle of growth that capitalism puts us in? That every year we need more research papers, more people to do that work, more grants, more revenue. Can we escape that? Yeah, these are the two questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will say that I will not use the word heterogeneity. I will use the word diversity. One of the biggest challenges in Indian education, in research, and also in the institutions is the question of diversity. If you go back, many of the national universities and national institutions that were established, with the exception of very few, I can name some of them, have become regional institutions and regional universities. And the change that has taken place is in terms of from diversity, we are trying to homogenizing the institutions, and that has a lot of implications. It becomes regional, it becomes parochial in its attitude, and also it becomes parochial in its orientation towards research, etc. This is a very dangerous trend. And if you look closely into the diversity issues, not only diversity in terms of the social strata from which the students are coming, I am not only talking about the student diversity, but also the teacher diversity, and also the diversity in terms of diversity of views. That is the place where Arunaji touched upon it, but I put it slightly differently. What is lacking in the universities today is what is called as a safe spaces for intellectual discussions. And if you look into the literature, you find that there used to be a tradition of safe spaces, but today there is no safe space, because you are scared to make a point, because you do not know, in the name of the diversity of the views, the other person who is sitting will be going and making complaint to the right places in inverted commas, So that will affect me adversely, So that is the way that discussions are centered. When I was talking about the post-truth era, why people are in the research field and in the institutions are not ready to come up with a bold position is also because of that. So that is one dimension. So I feel that diversity is important and diversity is necessary. Why? If you look into the knowledge production history, we have moved from mode 1 knowledge production to mode 2 knowledge production. And this is multidisciplinary, and one of the reasons and challenges that universities are facing today is the departmentalism could not progress beyond a point in the context of multicultural, multidimensional, and multidisciplinary research that has to take place, So universities find it very difficult to move towards a research where these type of changes are taking place. From mode 1 to mode 2, because universities are very good to carry out research in the mode 1 type of research, but when it comes to mode 2 types of knowledge production, universities perhaps are facing the challenge, So that is the way. So I will say that diversity is very nice, very good, that is to be promoted. We should see that diversity is not a liability and it is an asset. So our research capacity will depend upon how we can turn this liability into an asset in terms of the diversity. That is a challenge that we face, even in the classrooms. Now, if you see that more than 60% or 70% of the new students who are coming to the higher education system, even at the undergraduate level, are first generation learners coming from the socially disadvantaged groups. But our system has not changed to address this change in the context of teaching learning that is taking place or research that is taking place. That's the biggest challenge, because when you recruit a teacher, the teacher remains in the system for 30 years. The student is only for 3 years or 4 years, maximum 5 years. So we have not any mechanisms of orienting the teachers to adjust to the changing structure and the diversity of the students who are coming. And that is the biggest challenge in higher education today, So what I always used to say that the problem that higher education system has is that analysis paralysis. Today in the universities, especially undergraduate level, and even the postgraduate level in many places, there is nothing called analysis that is taking place. There is nothing called how to develop an argument. One of the reasons why the articles cannot be written and published is also because of the reason that there is no argument. Because that is the capacity that you develop, whether you do economics, sociology, chemistry, or physics, or any other idea. This is a central idea, a core skill that you have to develop, which can be developed. But the universities are failing to do that. And massification has substantially contributed to this process, and we are not ready to change it. So diversity is good, but that is to be handled very carefully.
Thank you.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are
audible now. Thank you for sharing your reflections as institution builders or leaders. My question to you is in the context of resilience. How can institutions sustain good intentions and practices seeded by founders and institution builders like you, so that the good governance practices you put into place, or any generation of leaders puts into place, can survive the onslaught of changing contexts? I ask this specifically in the context of Dr. Menon's reflections on AUD, and I'm sure these are some challenges we anticipate in institutions around the country, and recognizing that there may be some young people in this room who go on to become second or third generation of institution builders or leaders. Is there any advice you might want to share in the context of resilience overall? Sorry, my name is Payaswini, and I work in philanthropy. Thank you.
I can take it. I mean, though it's not addressed to me, let me take the question. I mean, I think we should take the answer from Aruna's talk in the morning, that you can create systems in a way that it is difficult to dismantle. It will be dismantled if somebody decides to dismantle, but try and make it as difficult as possible for us to dismantle. And part of it is organizational memory, as Shyam alluded, organizational memory which constantly keeps reminding you, no, this is not what this was all about. This was about a debate. This was not about a decision. This is not about, being high-handed and so on. So I guess it is much more about creating those systems which are hard to break. But, if one decides to break, one decides to break. In fact, I remember one of my bosses closed down a program in an institution that I was working and then set up a committee to say whether that decision was okay or not. I mean, that's also consultative process, post-truth consultative process. So, we'll take one last question from Nikhil. Okay, one last question from Nikhil, and there at the back, and we will really have to break for lunch. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so very quickly. Independent institutions, we all want them, we are desperate for them, we fight for them. How do you deal with their accountability? Because as you make them independent or autonomous, actually you find them, we've had this with the Information Commission, we empowered them in fighting for the law. We gave them everything including Lal Batti. That's what they've held on to largely. So how do you make sure accountability, and even Siddharth was a very good example of having one ombudsman, but it's not enough. And if independent institutions are to stand by people, how do you make that connection of accountability not to a funder, not to that group that they are supposed to be a bulwark against, but for the people?
I think, Jayna, would you like to take this question from a perspective that you come from the legal fraternity?
No, I think it's really important, and I'm glad you raised it, because internal institution accountability is something we don't often talk about. And how do you do it? I think large organizations, media organizations can have an ombudsman. We're seeing large corporations also having kind of boards and oversight boards and advisory boards, or different kinds of bodies. I think coming from my field, like an NGO, how do you have NGOs or other organizations have that? Perhaps have some kind of an independent body or a board to whom issues can be raised, and they can hold people leading the organization accountable for any practices which are kind of unethical or anything else. But we have to, I think, build a culture where that is being done and that is demanded and expected. So it can't be like a stray organization having it. And I think if we kind of try and build that culture where, if you don't have such an institutional setup, then you're kind of the odd one out. So how do we kind of move towards something like that, that every organization should have something in place?
In universities, Nikhil, particularly the good, vibrant universities in the peak of their vibrance, it's actually the students who are the conscience keepers of the university. And I've seen that in many instances. The teachers have a class problem. They are particularly university teachers. They're from the middle class, and they have all the insecurities, vulnerabilities, and self-absorption, which is characteristic of middle class. So they tend to buckle. And I have seen in several cases, and I can give instances where students have come forward and ensured that the teacher collective is more or less keeping their objectives intact.
I'm a student of BSc, and something wrong with the mic? Yeah. So my question is for Varghese sir and Menon sir both. I mean, whoever wishes to take this up. Like top businesses like Microsoft and Tata and Reliance are shifting their optics towards research and policy. So does this trend sort of target the space in research and make the idea of research and pursuing it sort of tepid and lukewarm for independent and autonomous institutions? Thank you.
I think one of the effects of corporatization of knowledge production is that the time spent on knowledge production has remained the same or increased in the universities, but the topics on which knowledge production takes place has substantially varied. I am talking this about based on 7 country experience studies done in Europe after the corporatization process took place. In that, what is happening is that in many of these institutions, the research topic is decided by the funding agencies. I have mentioned it while making my presentation, and the corporate sector. Now, previously what used to happen is that Microsoft and many other institutions, IBM, etc., they had their own in-house research. Now what is happening is that they are offloading this in-house research to public institutions, not at their cost, at the cost of the public institution. They'll give money for a fund, for a project, but the staff time that is spent and the administrative time that is spent is the public money. So it is a privatization of knowledge production for corporatization of profit at the cost of the public money, you know. This is a change that is taking place in many cases. So whether it is IBM or any other institution, Microsoft, etc., coming to the universities, that is a good thing. I will not say it is a bad thing. But what is happening is that the universities are at their mercy to get funds. So it is the decline of the public funds that is derailing the whole process of knowledge production and the way in which knowledge production takes place, you know. That is the way that it is happening. This is happening not only in the knowledge production, but also in the knowledge transactions. When you talk about MOOCs and many other new forms of learning that is taking place, it's actually commercialization. So it has a lot, we have less understood the implications of corporatization of higher education sector, not only in terms of provision of services, but also in the process of knowledge production. Why? Because this corporatization knowledge production is more dangerous than in knowledge transaction. Because it is the same knowledge that is produced by these means which will become the source for the decision making for others. So it is not confined to the company. Because earlier, the in-house knowledge production was used only for the company. So even if it is used or misused, it was limited in its sphere, limited in its influence. But this is getting wider acceptance and it is more dangerous. That is what I feel.